Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. The situation that we are looking at vis-a-vis the telecommunications industry is an important one because the lifeblood of the industry revolves around the acquisition and use of spectrum. Spectrum is simply the airwaves that we have around us that are modulated via electronic devices to create sound and then pass that sound on by way of electrical impulses to various devices that pick up these vibrations in the air and then turn those into sound at various ends and through various devices. As you will recall, mobility is principally based on this idea that you can transmit sound as waves over the airwaves, and the airwaves are split into various spectrum bands. So this is what we call these various bands are designated in terms of the frequency range. So you have at the lower end starting at 100 megahertz, 200 megahertz, 300 megahertz, going up into the gigahertz range. This is 35, 45, 55 gigahertz. So this is the whole spectrum band that we talk about. Now, as a general rule, the lower parts of the spectrum, that is what we call sub 1 gigahertz, which is 900, 800, 700, and so on downwards, tend to be the most attractive in terms of use from a mobility perspective. Why is that? Because the lower end of the spectrum, the airwaves travel further with less power, and they also have the ability to penetrate buildings at a much better rate than as you go higher into the 1800 or 2300 range and so on further up. So that's simply put what the spectrum is all about. Today we want to talk about a particular band which we call the 700 megahertz band. And so why has the 700 megahertz band come into play? So just a quick bit of history. So when originally mobile telephony started off, it used what we call traditionally the 900 megahertz band. Internationally, that was used. And the 900 band became internationally very useful as the result of global adoption of a single standard called GSM standard. All right, it is a French word that spells out the word Geospatial Mobile. So this GSM, which is the acronym for this, used the 900 megahertz spectrum, and so all countries of the world that adopted mobility using the GSM standards adopted the service in the 900 megahertz part of the band. So this is how the 900 megahertz band became the initial band which became useful for purposes of mobility. Very quickly what happened is that, of course, 900 became congested and we needed additional spectrum. And this is when what was the PCS movement started up, which started using the 1800 band. So the 1800 band got conjoined to the 900, and in India and in other parts of the world, 900 and 1800 became the dominant parts of the spectrum that began to be used for purposes of mobility. Subsequent to that, the 800 band came into use as the result of the introduction of what we call CDMA technology, and again an acronym which explains a certain type of technology used. So when the CDMA technology came into use, they used the 800 band, and that was also used in India, and several operators acquired 800 megahertz spectrum in order to roll out their CDMA mobile services. So now we have 800, 900 and 1800. These were the three predominant bands that were used in India for mobility. In the year 2010, the government of India, again as a result of demands for additional spectrum to meet the capacity and the growth in telephony, especially on the mobile end, decided to put up two additional bands, one in the 2100 and one in the 2300 megahertz range. The 21 megahertz range was previously held predominantly by the Army and Defense Forces and had been freed up for use by private operators, and that was sold for 3G technology. At the same time, the 2300 megahertz spectrum was put up for auction as well, and that band was supposed to be used for 4G technology. Subsequent to this, of course, we had various rounds of auctions, and we are presently looking at additional spectrum in the 700 band coming up for auction. Where was the 700 band used previously? It had been reserved for the broadcasting industry, TV principally. And now that TV broadcasting has gone over to a digitized medium, they do not require all of this amount of spectrum that had been earmarked for them. As a result, that 700 megahertz spectrum has been freed up and been given to the DoT for auction for use by commercial players to provide mobility services. So 100 megahertz of spectrum approximately is now going to be put up as a result of the upcoming auctions that are slated perhaps for June, July. So that's a quick rundown of how we have come to where we are in terms of 700. You can see that 700 is a very valuable part of the spectrum, again because it is on the lower part of the spectrum, and so it's a very desirable part of the spectrum for use by mobile operators. What you will see on the screen right now is an indicator of the contributions that the telecom industry in India has come up with, right? And you'll notice that for one thing, we have the lowest voice rates in the world. We have over 500 million villages already covered. We contribute about 6.1% of the total GDP of India. We have among the highest contributions in foreign direct investments over the last 10 years. We bring in somewhere in the vicinity today of anywhere from 8 to 10 billion US dollars, and we contribute directly to 22 lakh employment and indirectly to another 20 lakh jobs. We are among the highest contributors to the government, nearly 70,000 crores per annum paid to the government for spectrum and for license fees and spectrum usage charges. We are the second largest private sector globally. Today we have over 1 billion connections, and we earn about 750,000 crores from that sector. All right, here is a snapshot of India's digital footprint. We have a total population of about 1.25. We have 319 million internet users, and 118 million of them are active social media users, and we have 1 billion subscriptions that are presently in place. If you look at the next chart, it basically compares us to international operators, and you will notice that on average a single operator in India has about 18 megahertz of spectrum. If you compare that to international operators, you will notice that an average international operator has on average 50 megahertz of spectrum available. Now, what is even more telling is that even though we have only 18 compared to 50, the density of population that we have is far and away much, much higher than just about every international country we compare ourselves with. So again, this is the fact that we have more population, a higher density, and lower amounts of spectrum when compared with global standards. So when you look at the upcoming auction of spectrum, you will find that the government is today saying, yes, we recognize that we need to provide the industry with additional spectrum because new services in the digital area are starting up. More and more consumers are demanding higher speeds, and not only are they demanding higher speeds when they buy smartphones, those smartphones get connected to the internet and they start downloading various applications from the internet, and there's a very heavy demand for applications that provide digital content in terms of video. So people are very interested in looking at movies and video clips and TV, and some in live streaming formats. So the demand on our spectrum increases, and that is why the government has decided to put up more spectrum to make it available to meet the demand of the consumers. So what bands of spectrum are coming up? Principally 700 megahertz is coming up, some 800 megahertz band is coming up, a little bit of 900 and 1800 that was left over from the previous auctions. We have 21 megahertz still available, 2300 megahertz and 2500 megahertz. These are all additional spectrum bands that are now becoming available. Please also keep in mind that as we go forward, because of the march of technology, 4G, which was previously reserved for 2300 megahertz band, is now becoming available for use in just about every band. So if you want to adopt LTE technology, or what we call 4G technology, you can use it if you have 800 megahertz, if you have 700 megahertz, if you have 900 megahertz, if you have 1800 megahertz, if you have even some higher bands in the 23 and 25. All of these, because of technological enhancements and improvements, can be used for purposes of LTE. What will happen is that as operators acquire additional spectrum, the old legacy networks of 2G will be falling away, and the new technology, which is 3G and 4G, will begin to start dominating. 700, again, as I indicated, is a very attractive band for providing 4G and LTE services. We just want to continue providing you with a context of the pricing of spectrum, and here you'll see countries like Germany, Denmark, and then India. And this is a metric that we use. We look at the price of spectrum on a population adjusted basis, right? And so this is USD, denoted in US dollars per megahertz per population number, right? So again, what is the takeaway? The takeaway is simply that if you look at the India pricing of spectrum in the various bands, they're far and away more expensive than what international companies pay in US dollars for their spectrum. So not only do they have more, but they also pay less than we do. So we have less and we pay more per megahertz of spectrum. That is what this slide talks about. Next. This basically talks about the financial industry, and started off with a nominal amount of debt at about 83,000 crores. Today we stand in fiscal year 15 at about 350,000 crore rupees of debt. Now, why is that important? It's important because it's a measure of how much more resources the operators can obtain to continue to invest in our networks and in our operations. So if you look at the right-hand corner, that number 5.2x basically says that if you look at our EBITDA number, what is EBITDA? Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It is a measure of what we would call free cash. That is the amount of cash available to the organization to meet its various obligations like debt and other such obligations. Today, we would require 5.2 times our annual revenue at the EBITDA level, right? So EBITDA is after you deduct for relevant expenses, right? So we will need 5.2 times. So it'll take about 5+ years to repay, if you will, the debt if we were to use all of the money for just servicing our debt, including repayment. So that's not a very good position to be in. And at 5 times, we've almost hit the cap as to how much more debt the industry can take on. So what, again, this chart indicates is that if we want to continue to fund our operations from debt, we're going to have to increase revenue quite substantially. And that's going to be a hard task given the continuous amounts of money we are asked to plow back into acquiring spectrum and investing in networks. So this again will give you a point of reference to international standards in terms of price of spectrum. It may be a little fuzzy, but the takeaway is that we pay almost 30% or more per megahertz of spectrum than any other international operator. On the left-hand side, you see the various countries that have entered into auctions like we have: Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden. And in all of those instances, this is, by the way, in pound sterling. This is the UK denominated currency. So if you want to compare this to the US dollar, the US dollar is 1.3 approximately to a pound sterling, somewhere in that vicinity. All right, so just be careful. But again, the point we wish to make is that if you look at these prices, Indian operators pay significantly more per megahertz of spectrum than our international counterparts do in other parts of the world. So then what do we want to talk about? We want to talk about why 700 price is so prohibitive. If you look at the TRAI recommendation, what the TRAI has done is saying that, look, what should we determine to be the reserve price for the 700 megahertz price spectrum when it is put up for auction. Now, just by way of clarification, the reserve price is the beginning number in which all auction bidders will have to start their bidding. That is the absolute floor below which they will not accept any bids. So all auction bidding invariably will start off at that reserve price and escalate depending on the demand for the spectrum. Presently, what has that reserve price been set at? It has been set at 4 times the value of 1800 megahertz spectrum. As I just indicated previously, 1800 megahertz spectrum has been sold in previous auctions in India, and so therefore there is a market determined price for 1800 across the board. The TRAI has basically taken the 1800 market discovered price and said, we believe that the 700 megahertz is 4 times more efficient than 1800. Again, keep in mind I said that the lower in the band you go, the more efficient it is, and the better it is. Higher, less efficient. So therefore, they said 700 is worth 4 times 1800. Now, the first part of this slide basically says, let's test that assumption when the TRAI set up its reserve price. And we said, again, if you look internationally, the most you can find is that the 700 band was priced at about 2.2, 2.7, or even less than 1 times 1800. So the number that says that it is to be valued at 4 times, again puts India at the very high end of the price of 700 megahertz spectrum. All right, so therefore affordability becomes a big risk. Right, and so therefore we and the industry have been saying that this is going to be a difficult proposition for the industry. And just to give you a benchmark, if you were to acquire 5 megahertz of 700 for a pan-India license, that means you got 5 megahertz in just about every state in India, and if you acquired that just at the reserve price, forget about what the price may actually be. If you did that at the reserve price, you would have to pay 57,000 crore rupees for just 5 megahertz. Now, if an operator wanted to acquire 2 such bands, so a total of 10 megahertz, it would be cheaper for that entity to buy out Idea than to buy 10 megahertz of spectrum. So this is the anomaly where a whole company such as Idea is valued less by the marketplace than 10 megahertz of 700 spectrum, which has no network, no consumers, no customers, no revenue, but yet it's worth a heck of a lot more than a fully running company. So therefore, this is the reason the industry has been protesting the high values that have attached or been attached to the 700 megahertz price. Again, this is a table which says how much ARPU again is average revenue per user. How much revenue would we have to earn in order to buy a megahertz of spectrum? And again, you will see we are extremely on the high side, number 7. So we will have to, we need 147, dollars, to buy 1 megahertz of spectrum based on the ARPU, that is the average revenue that we provide per user. All right. So again, the lower the number, obviously, the better it is. And you can see that we are at the extreme high end in terms of the pricing of our spectrum, in terms of the revenue that we can expect to get from an average user. And again, let me give you another metric. The average revenue per user in India is today at about 180 rupees. All right, that's probably close to about $3 US. All right, so the average revenue per user provides Indian operators with about $3 US per month. In international markets, the average user provides the operator with close to 45 to 50 US. So again, let me round out the discussion. We pay approximately 30 to 35% more for our spectrum. We pay international prices for the equipment, but yet we earn substantially less from an average user than our counterparts do in the rest of the world. Next, please. So therefore, the recommendation from TRAI, we believe, should be revisited because, again, the 4 times multiple that was used was as a result of TRAI's recommendation from 2012. That was a period in time when spectrum was scarce, market dynamics were very different, and so on and so forth. And so market dynamics are much, much different. There are fewer players, many have left, and the market dynamics have changed substantially. And there's additional spectrum, so spectrum shortages are not as acute as they were. So the supply side of the equation has changed dramatically, and so therefore we believe that it is appropriate to use that understanding to revisit this whole idea of what should be charged as the reserve price for 700. All right, thank you. That is it, and so we shall now be open to questions. So somebody wants a
question is already shared with you. Can you please take them?
So we have the first question. The first question is, when, according to the timeline, do you see 3G or 4G services dominating the Indian market? That's part 1 of the question. Part 2 of the question is, how do you see operators providing a fair service quality to 2G users as we move to 3G and 4G?
So presently, 85% of our network is given over to voice telephony, which is principally what we call 2G services. The newer acquired spectrum, please remember that 3G and 4G were being provided on separate bands, and that voice was provided on the 900, 1800, and 800 bands. So the predominant acquisition of that spectrum in the 900, 1800, and 800 is still being used for predominantly voice. It's only about anywhere from 15% of the total revenue stream for operators now comes from data services. So yes, 3G and 4G services are rolling out. Just about all of the major operators have indicated that they are doing that quicker and quicker. So we believe that by the year 2018 to 2019, we should have pan-India 3G, 4G services in just about all of our district headquarters, and principally covering just about all of our block headquarters, and again in many of our rural areas below that. So again, remember that as per the license conditions itself, operators are required to provide coverage up to 30% of the block headquarters as a result of acquiring spectrum in the 2100 and 2300 range, which happened in the year 2010. So yes, within the next 2 years, we should expect to see pretty wide coverage all about across India, and going very deep into even the rural areas for 3G and 4G services. I travel a fair bit, and I'm surprised in a sense to see, one, the quality of the 3G services, this large size of the footprint of 3G services, and at the same time also having adequate amounts of 2G available, albeit in a digital enhanced environment. Now, in terms, again, please keep in mind that the bulk of our revenue still comes from voice, and so operators are not turning off the switch in terms of the 2G networks. It's both and. So we provide and continue to maintain 2G and 3G and 4G because of the additional spectrum bands that are being acquired are being used to push out the more ubiquitous 3G, 4G services and data services. So that's the first part. The second part, in terms of the quality of service, again, please remember that the quality of service is set internationally at 2%, which means basically that you can't have drop calls at more than 2%. So just about all of our states we meet that. There are certain hotspots like in Delhi, like in Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, which because of the very high demand concentrated in local pockets demands an extreme amount of spectrum, which obviously we're in the process of acquiring, so we still have those hotspots that we have to address to try and get the drop calls. In terms of voice quality, I think as 3G and 4G begin to roll out more ubiquitously, you'll see a better voice quality across the board today. Because of handoff challenges between 4G, 3G, and 2G, there's challenges in terms of seamless handoffs and some voice quality, but we expect that that will be fixed very quickly, shortly, certainly by the next 2 years. As 3G and 4G become pervasive, the quality of service and the customer experience will be really very good.
There was a question previous to that. If the revenue earned by telecom service providers is on a decreasing trend as comparative to their country, whether this will have a cascading effect on the foreign investment?
Absolutely will, because foreign investors are looking for a rate of return or some return on their investment. So if we can't provide investors with a meaningful rate of return, clearly they're not going to be interested in parking their money with us. Fortunately, India is now still one of the brighter spots in terms of our general economy. So again, that is another factor which is attractive for investors. Our industry is still growing at a pretty rapid clip. We still have a very high penetration rate to go for data services. We are looking at rolling out machine-to-machine, Internet of Things, cloud computing. So we are still a pretty attractive destination for FDIs. We have to then make sure that the revenue streams continue to be robust, that the regulatory environment, the policy environment continues to ensure that the industry can operate profitably so that foreign investors can continue to feel comfortable providing that investment. Please also keep in mind that we live in a global economy. Investors look at global opportunities. So we're not just looking at India, obviously, for destination money. So we have to make sure that we are also competitive from an international perspective.
The next question is, the earlier spectrum auctions fetched more than expected by the government. So their thinking may be right.
Well, this is something that would be hard to speculate on. Yes, you are right in terms of saying that in the previous two major auctions, there were a few smaller ones, the amount of money that was originally set as the reserve price by the government was far exceeded by the auction process. So let me indicate why that would be so. In the first instance, in 2010, when the first auction was held, it was for the 2100 and the 2300 rate for 3G and 4G services. Please remember at that time, there was no indication from the government or the DoT that any additional spectrum would be made available. So operators were scrambling for a very limited supply. So supply was highly constrained. And Economics 101 teaches us that when demand outstrips the supply, the price setting will tend to get higher. All right, and that is precisely what happened in the first round of auction. In the second round of auctions, which happened in 2014, where again some very high prices were paid, was because operators were forced to go back into the marketplace to reobtain their spectrum because their license period for the first 20 years had come to an end, and they had to bid to get back spectrum to get additional 20 years extension of the license. All right, so here again, there was a situation where there was a constraint in terms of supply, and in addition, operators were bidding fiercely against one another just to continue to ensure that they had enough spectrum to continue their business and not go out of business. So I think those were two anomalies which are not prevalent today, and so therefore we think that there should be less of a frenzy in terms of trying to price the spectrum.
The next question is, I guess 3G and 4G are competing for the marketplace. Is it fair to say 3G will lose out in this race as the spectrum is mostly 5 megahertz?
So the spectrum bands that are being used for 3G, we believe will be continued to play on a parallel basis, and this is, by the way, globally. All right, again, remember that at present the differential speeds between 4G and 3G are significantly different for consumers to say that, hey, listen, I'm going to pay a significant premium for 4G services as opposed to 3G services. There are lots of applications that run very well on 3G that have the requisite speed, and it's only when you go to high video content, real-time video streaming and the like, that 4G becomes more and more necessary and important. So we think that both 3G and 4G will continue to go side by side, which has been the international experience as well. So we don't believe that that will fall off. And you know, again, we'll watch the consumer's demand for speed and quality, and then decide how much spectrum needs to be allocated to 4G and continuously to 3G. You're right in terms of saying 5 megahertz of 3G is limited, and shows clearly going forward, most of the investments and most of the spectrum that is going to be acquired will be for 4G LTE type services.
The next question is, if any operator starts 4G services pan-India using 5 megahertz spectrum in the 700 megahertz band, how long will it take to break even at current reserve price as per current industry situation?
So if we look at the present reserve price, right, and if we begin to start saying that, listen, I get an ARPU today of 180 rupees, and let's say that goes up to 500 rupees, all right, which is kind of the price point that people are talking about, and for 500 rupees you get some fairly substantial bucket of megahertz or gigahertz to use, all right. it would usually, as a rule of thumb, take anywhere from 11 plus years to break even based on the spectrum prices and the additional fees that we pay to the government. Please remember that we pay an additional 15% of every rupee we earn that goes back to the government by way of license fees and spectrum usage charges. So if you throw that in, break even gets pushed out to the 12th and 13th year, and then in a 20-year license, you only have about 4 to 5 years to really begin to start recuperating in any meaningful fashion a return on your investment.
This would be the last question, which is, sir, I do not think that 1.7 billion US dollars per megahertz for 700 seems totally absurd at the outset. What is the industry's take on what the ideal price should be should look like, considering that we are talking of an extremely efficient spectrum here?
So I think the point to be made is that, listen, there are two imperatives, right? Yes, in an auction process, if you allow the auction process to go ahead, in today's environment where spectrum trading is allowed, sharing is allowed, there's a lot of consolidation in the industry, all of those dynamics means that the pressure on acquiring more spectrum is somewhat muted, all right? So yes, we believe that there will be folks who would be interested in acquiring 700 even at these prices, but it is probably not going to be for a pan-India footprint. What operators will do is buy the 700 in areas where they don't have any meaningful 900 or 1800 or 800, and again use it to fill in those types of pockets and holes. And so I think that is going to be the trend. But again, let me just also say that in order to look at the overall financial health of the industry, we have suggested to the government that in the old revenue share days where we did not pay upfront for spectrum, the government got its money by charging us a license fee and a spectrum usage charge. Now that we are paying upfront for the spectrum, no matter how much, we are saying it's time to look at these other levies. There's 15%, which consists of 8% by way of license fee and another 4 to 5% by way of spectrum usage charge and some other levies. Reduce those burdens since you're getting your money up front. We're also saying that in other parts of the world, the winning criteria has not always been the highest bid. So winning criteria has also been set as those who are willing to offer the lowest price and the deepest penetration in terms of network rollout may perhaps be the winner. That has been tried in countries like Nigeria, where they indicated that, listen, we are not interested in getting a whole lot of money for the government. We are more concerned that the networks roll out for the benefit of citizens. Again, I believe it was in Sri Lanka, when the price went up to a certain point in the auction, the regulator stepped in and stopped the auction and allowed that price to continue. So again, there are instances when, for the common good and for the benefit of citizens, alternative mechanisms and pricing have been introduced.